I was born in Cheltenham and I've lived here all my life. Well, the first house I remember um, my, was a semi-detached end terraced house, and it had an attic, and I used to like playing up and down the stairs to the attic. And then my father had an allotment outside as well. And I went out there one day with him, and he said, if you dig down far enough there, you'll get to Australia. So, yes, my grandmother, in the meantime, had come to live with us because my grandfather had died. And so I remember growing up in this house with her as well, and she stayed with us until she died, and until we moved. Well, when I'd gone to school, I think I went when I was 5. My cousin Michael Holton, he was 18 months younger than me, but he was at the same school. I remember that very well with fond memories because the couple who were running at the school were Welsh, and he was quite autistic, and she was the one who had all the brains. And I used to like playing netball because the school had a big long garden and at the side of the house. And I became netball captain as I grew older. We hadn't got tennis courts at school, but we used to be walked down to Montpellier, the top of Cheltenham, and we had somebody who taught us to play tennis. We used to go swimming in the river, which I certainly wouldn't do now. My father taught me to swim at quite an early age. Well, we've had a Lido in Cheltenham for a long time. It was opened in the 1930s. It was always very popular and used a lot. And we used to go there to the Lido swimming because there's a children's pool on the main one. And I used to love that. My father's grandmother, old Granny Holton, we used to call her, my cousin and I used to be left there with her very often while our mothers went shopping together. And that was when she used to sit there with her long black skirt and a little dog by the side of her and tell us all about these things that she'd done and where she'd been. She and great-grandfather had the fish shop. Well, he decided, I think, that he was going to go off to America to make his money. I don't know how many children she'd got then, but she had 10 altogether, and she was nearly 100 when she died. But in the meantime, he, somehow or other, asked her to go over there to him, you see. My cousin and I often wondered who looked after the young children she'd got when she went over to America, because it took her, what did I tell you in the beginning, 3 weeks to get there. Anyway, she went over there, and I don't know how long she stayed there for. He was doing quite well, and she said she always had to go about with a gun in a skirt pocket. So she did that, came back, and she went backwards and forwards 3 times on a big old sailing ship. My cousin and I thought that my great-grandfather, had probably had some more children over in the States while he was there. It was Wild West, I know, that sort of thing, because my cousin, the boy, Michael, who's died, he thought it was really exciting, at the time when we were being told about it. but I should think it was pretty dangerous. My mother and had come from Hastings, so sometimes we went back there with my grandmother to see their relations, and so we stayed in Hastings a few times, and I remember going across to France on the paddle steamer. The paddle steamer used to come along the coast and pick up people and then go across to France, and I thought that was really good. I enjoyed that very much. Other times we went to Southsea. My grandmother said she saw the advert on the promenade for flying over to the Isle of Wight. So that was arranged and we all went over there. And that was the first time most of us had flown, and certainly my grandmother. And she thought it was great. And yes, I remember that very well. It was just a small plane, and I think there were 6 of us in it. It was quite exciting. We went to Southsea 2 or 3 times because it was very easy for my grandmother to walk along the promenade. And then, of course, the war came in 1939, and that sort of rather stopped everything. I was 11 when it started and 17 when it finished. We had a big air raid shelter, and of course we all had to have a gas mask, and you had to take them everywhere you went, and if you didn't you got into trouble. And but yes, it went on, and school continued. We just had to manage the best we could. When there was food rationing, you had a little book with coupons in it, and you had to register with a certain shop, say like one on the corner, and you couldn't go and use your coupons anywhere else. You had to stick to the one that you were registered with. The egg ration was about 1 a week, I think, per person, or you could forfeit that, and they would give you food for chickens, meal or whatever. So we kept chickens. We had about 5 or 6 actually laying hens, and that was really good. We had plenty of eggs like that. Otherwise, my mother couldn't make any cakes or whatever. There was always milk. I remember that. Well, the cows had to be milked, so we had milk. I think it was being restricted because you couldn't go very far. Well, it was all right if you went on your bicycle, but my mother didn't ride a bicycle, so she didn't, couldn't do that. Which was frustrating for her because she could drive, and there weren't that number of women driving, in the early 30s. He was in the gas industry, and at that time it was the Cheltenham and District Gas Company, and he worked his way up and he became manager of that. Well, then of course it became nationalised, and I remember him being worried about his job, whether what would happen. However, he was kept on, and he was made manager of a big area. Also, a house went with it, so that made things easier for him. So we moved into this house with my grandmother, who was living with us anyway, and the house was right next to the gasworks, which was fine. It was a big house. Well, we stayed there, and I was there when I got married, and my father retired soon afterwards. Yes, so he had a small ration of petrol because he had to go round and visit his different villages that the gas was being sent out to, one of which was Winchcombe. And I remember going there, and they had a little, just quite a small gas holder, enough for the village, you see. And because it was, Winchcombe was a lot smaller than what it is now. And so on those days, if he was going out around the country, my mother and I used to go with him, or my grandmother, to have a day out, you know, and go somewhere different and see things. So we were lucky in that respect. I think he used to get information somehow about whether it was okay to go out during, you know, during that day or whatever it was. I don't remember being anywhere other than home when the bombers came over. It was when the air raid sirens went that you needed to take cover. You know, they didn't very often come over in the daytime because they could be seen easier. They used to put barrage balloons up, very big, tethered to the ground, huge things, if all round anywhere where there were factories, so that the bombers couldn't get in low, otherwise they'd go into one of these balloons, and that was the end of the plane. Well, it was December the 11th, 1941, actually. And yes, the bombers had been going over to Coventry and Birmingham every night. But on this particular night, one of them dropped an incendiary bomb, which of course lit up the whole area, including the railway line. So some of them turned round and they came back. We heard them coming back and aimed for the railway line, but they missed, and it went on a whole lot of little houses at the end of a street and killed quite a few people, I think. I don't remember how many. We were already in the shelter, my grandmother and the dog and my mother and quite a few other people. I don't know where they'd come from, across the road probably. And then my father was in there for a little while, and he said to my mother, "I've got to go." And of course she was very worried and upset, and she said, "Where on earth are you going in the middle of an air raid?" And he said, "Well, I've somebody, one of the wardens or somebody who was on duty, and don't forget we didn't have phones, had told him that a bomb had been dropped on Pilly Bridge, which is went over the old railway line, the same line as the one near where we were, because it worked its way up to Andoversford, and I'm not quite sure where it finished, but it was quite an important railway line then. He'd been told that a bomb had been dropped on Pilly Bridge, and that he said, "I've got a gas main going across there. It's my responsibility. I've got to go and see to it straight away." And of course we were all worried about him doing that, but because he'd been in the First World War, it didn't bother him too much. Well, he wasn't that worried as what we were, because, you know, he was doing dangerous things. He was used to that. So he went off to see to his gas main, and incidentally that bridge wasn't opened again for traffic until well after the war, which was a bit of a nuisance because you had to go all the way around somewhere else. Then he came back, and when the all clear had gone, and my mother said, "Oh, well, we can go back in the house." And he said, "No, you can't go back in there. And because she said, why not? He said, well, all the windows have been blown in and there's glass everywhere, and some of the tiles had come off the roof of that house. Somehow or other, through the air raid wardens, he'd arranged that we would all go to my grandmother's, his mother, who had this, who was a licensee for this little pub right in the middle of the town. And it was a tall old building and with lots of little narrow stairs. I don't know how she managed in there actually. And he took us, we were able to go there, and of course we saw all the devastation and, you know, what had happened. There were people running about and people who'd been injured and just a mess everywhere. Fire people out, police, everybody trying to help people. And I think we were there for, well, I know my mother had got presents laid out on the spare bed, ready, you know, that she'd been buying ready for Christmas. And of course she was worried about whether we'd be able to get back into the house, you know, for Christmas, because there wasn't really room for us all in my grandmother's place. However, they sort of cleaned it up and put all glass, not double glazing of course, put the glass back in the windows. And I remember when we went in there the next day, she was in tears because it was such a mess. So anyway, we were able to get home again in time for Christmas, and it was all a bit upside down. Well, I was quite attracted to doing that sort of thing anyway, and I think I must have had a friend who was already doing it, being a hairdresser. So I had to start from the beginning and be a junior. Yes, I was learning hairdressing, but I also used to do people's nails as well. This was at a very upmarket hairdresser's in the promenade. Very nice. Well, I used to cycle there every day. Well, I went in the morning, came home for lunch, and so I did plenty of cycling, backwards and forwards. But everybody else did the same. So. Well, he hadn't long been back from the end of, you know, the war, and he'd been in India for 4 years, and so he hadn't seen his parents or brothers. He was one of 5 boys, and they all gradually came back and were in the business, in the motor business. But my father-in-law had started the business before the war. I had a little car for my business because I was a mobile hairdresser. So I took it in there for service, and I think there was something wrong with it probably. And I met him in there. People, the boys who I'd known, had never got any money, and he'd got a very nice car. So that was, yeah, that was lovely. I think we got engaged in May and married in November. Things were still getting back to normal, you know. When a country's been at war for 6 years and then it stops, it doesn't all just come back to normal again. It takes a long time. Well, Norman was Catholic, and I'm not, but that never made any difference. And we were married in St Gregory's Church, which is a Catholic church, in Cheltenham. Food was still rationed, and a lot of other things were as well. You had clothing coupons and So I remember saving up for my wedding outfit, and no, it was, they were, if you had 50 people, that was quite a lot. And we just went up to London for a long weekend, I think it was, or a few days. Went to a show, they'd started again then. Yeah, so it was lovely. The government took commandeered the garage, and in fact, they commandeered a lot of places as little factories or whatever, you know. Then, of course, they had to give it back to him at the end of the war, and so then that was when he started the bigger part of the garage. I used to do quite a lot of driving because at that time we were Roots Group and Humber Hillman and Sunbeam Talbot, which were made in Coventry. And of course, there weren't any car transporters then, so we had to go and fetch them, or they had to be fetched from where they were made, the factories, you know. And every now and again, I used to go with 2 or 3 other people from the garage and go and fetch the new cars and on trade plates, and you had to drive them at 30 miles an hour. Well, no more than 30, because they had to be running in those days. People understood, they say, oh, it's a new car just coming up. We did fuel economy rallies to try and cover different distances on as little petrol as possible. So they did a few things to the car, and I'm not sure what what they did do. I know he told me, he said, if you go over a certain speed, something will cut in and it will make a roaring noise, so you mustn't let that happen, you see. This was on the fuel economy rallies. And we went all up into Wales in the middle of the night, and, well, the rallies usually went on for 24 hours, so one of us navigated and the other one drove, and we took turns. And yes, we did quite a few of those, sort of in the middle of the winter like now. And cars didn't have heaters then. It was all good experience. What with that and driving brand new ones. We belonged to the Cheltenham Motor Club, and they used to borrow Prescott Hill Climb a couple of times during the summer months. And, you know, people, it's a nice place to go, and you take a picnic, and you start on the starting grid down below, and it's a winding hill climb. So it was all a case of being in the right gear at the right place, and you start down below and you're timed until you finish at the top, and that was good fun as well. So I enjoyed that. We were married a little while before we had your mother, because we hadn't known each other very long, really, or had the opportunity to go places and do things. And as time went on after the war finished, things began to get easier, and petrol wasn't rationed and food wasn't rationed, and it was a freedom that people hadn't had. And and also Grandpa Norman had jaundice very badly before he came home from India, and so he needed to put on a bit of weight. Things started to get better and easier. When Yvette was born, that was all great, and she was born in the flat where we were living at the time, which was only just down the road from the motor club. It was halfway between the garage and the motor club. And there was a big garden with the house that the flat was part of. We had half of the garden. One day I'd put Yvette outside in the pram to have her sleep, and I went outside and the cat was in the pram as well. Which horrified me a bit, because I thought, oh, could have been sitting on top of her. Of course, it was warm in there, and so we had to have a cat net over on the pram. It connects from the hood down to the handle to stop her getting in there anymore. And also food rationing had finished by this time. There weren't supermarkets about. In fact, the first one I went in with my mother in Bournemouth when Yvette was quite small, it was a Waitrose, and we couldn't believe it. It looked so different. You know, we'd never seen a great big grocery store like that before. Yeah, so things got better in all ways. Grandpa said what we would like, and it was built to our specifications, really. And we were very ahead of time because we had central heating. Big old fin radiators, you know, not the flat ones like that. And we'd moved out of this flat where Mummy was born, which was fine. It was big, and, you know, there was plenty of room in the flat. Well, there was only Grandpa and I and Mummy as a baby. And we were right near the park, and also the garage. There were quite a lot of advantages to it. And there was a shop down the road, big grocer's shop. I mean, all that worked quite well. They didn't have shops so near in Bournemouth Road. However, we were very pleased to move into our own. I think we moved just around New Year into the house. And it was amazing to see it all come together, because we had parquet flooring. There was, yes, solid floors. This isn't. We had a big garden, and which was sloping down to a stream called Hatherley Brook, and it was all fields beyond that, and it was facing south at the back, so it was all, yes, it was very nice. When my parents were married, they couldn't afford very much. They were both working, and when they got married, they just went away, I think, for the weekend. But then they saved up and they went to Paris, and they thought that was absolutely marvellous, and they used to talk about it, you know, for years afterwards. Yes, that they'd had a lovely time there in Paris. I've worked it out. They were married in 25. That's on the clock. It's on the occasion of his marriage.
January 25.
Yes, that's right. Yes. They must have gone to Paris in 27, I think. And then I was born in 28. And they had such a wonderful time there. And hence, that's how I got the name Yvonne. And then, having started that idea, it went on to Yvette and Michelle. So. And my father had been in the First World War in France as well. He was in the trenches. I think that was another thing as well. I think that was another reason why they wanted to go to Paris. He talked about being in France. I know that was during the war, but I think he wanted to go back and see what it was like. And when I was about 8, something like that, the paddle steamers used to come along the coast and then go from Hastings and go across to Boulogne. And then he really wanted to go to the Ypres where he'd been, and there was this big monument with all the names on the people, all the regiments and the people who'd been killed, and he'd lost a lot of friends during the war. And so he wanted to see if he could find them, and I remember him giving my mother and I each a list of names to look for and where to look. And Meningate, that's it, Meningate. And yes, I haven't forgotten that, because yes, we found quite a few.
Did he, because I know a lot of people didn't, did he ever talk to you much about his experiences in the
Not
First
a
World War?
lot, no. I know he used to talk to his brothers about it, because they'd all been doing something during the war. The one was in the Royal Flying Corps, which is what I think the RAF was known as before it became the RAF. His youngest brother was in the Merchant Navy all his life, right from school. And his other brother, Jimmy, who was our best man at the wedding, he'd been out in Italy and been decorated as saving people's lives. Yes, it was.
So they all his brothers survived?
Yes, they survived the war. Yes, they did. Yes. Appreciate what you've got, because I think they're all very lucky. Love everybody, all your sisters and brothers or whoever, and because I grew up during the war, all my relations lived quite near, and so all my cousins were nearby, and we were just all one big family, which to me meant a lot. Well, it did to everybody, and except for some of the young men who had to got called up and went off to war. But otherwise, we used to have big picnics in the summer and go swimming in the river, and which wasn't a very good idea. But we weren't the only people doing it. There was a place called Wainloads on the bank of the Severn, between Tewkesbury and Gloucester, actually. And there was quite a nice beach there on the river, and we used to go in there, but I certainly wouldn't do that sort of thing again. And we used to take a picnic, whatever we'd got with our rations, and that's how we enjoyed ourselves, and that's what I grew up to appreciate, small things. Are we starting now?
Well, yeah. So, yeah.
Have a little flag and
yeah. Well,